aerodynamics, a slipstream is the region behind a moving object in which a wake of fluid, typically air or water, is moving at velocities comparable to that of the moving object itself, such as the wake behind a speeding boat or a jet plane. Most do not know, though, that the term has another use, as a genre of literature originally described by science fiction author Bruce Sterling in his 1989 essay of the same name. Sterling's own description of slipstream as a genre is slippery at best, but it can be summarized as a movement growing out of both science fiction and literary fiction, blending the qualities of both into a stranger amalgamation, unfamiliar to both of its parents. For Sterling, slipstream was the wake behind the accelerating body of mainstream literature at the turn of the millennium, where writers sought to describe the ever stranger conditions of modern existence by transcending the constraints of genre that commercial publishing demand they fit into. At least, that's what he thought. The fact of the matter is that slipstream has never exactly caught on as a term, and not many authors have self-consciously associated themselves with the genre. Despite that fact, the idea of slipstream has remained in the substrata of literary criticism, a genre whose name hardly describes what it is and who has no conscious acolytes. 2006's Feeling Very Strange, the slipstream anthology, sought to bring the genre into wider circulation, providing a smorgasbord of stories by authors, including luminaries such as Kelly Link, Ted Chiang, and Michael Chabon, who the authors felt embodied, in their words, 21st century schizoid art. Ben and I sat down to talk about the anthologies, the story therein, the concept of slipstream as a genre, and the strange place the whole concept of genre finds itself in 2023. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Welcome to the Infinite Library. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Infinite Library. Thank you so much for listening. It is your regularly scheduled bi-weekly episode. So we're doing something a little bit new today. It's episode 4. It's all still a bit new, but it's going to be a little bit different than what we've done before. We've mostly been talking about novels so far on this show. Today we're going to be talking about a short story collection. And we're not just going to be talking about that collection and the stories therein. We're also going to be using this as a jumping off point to talk about a genre. That genre is called slipstream. The book we're going to be talking about is Feeling Very Strange, the Slipstream Anthology. This was Ben's idea. So I know he has some thoughts about, this concept. This is probably a genre you've never heard of before. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and these lovely stories therein. So Ben, why don't you tell us a little bit about why you want to do this book and what you think is interesting about it?
Yes, listener, you heard that right. This is a Infinite Library classic episode, just me and John. No spooky thematic shtick. We're just talking raw literature, and we're talking Feeling Very Strange. So this was gifted to me by a friend of mine, and when she gave it to me, she told me that slipstream as a genre was something that she'd seen like a while ago, more or less when it came out, when Wikipedia was listing emerging literary genres. And one of them was slipstream and the other one was postmodern fiction, which I'm sure is going to come up when we talk about it. And she noted that the position of the genre is kind of a strange position, because if you read the intro of Feeling Very Strange, and they reference an essay that was written in 1989 Sci-Fi Eye, they describe slipstream as existing between literary fiction and science fiction, and sort of the genre in which you use genre plus, I would say, elevated literary tropes like collage, various kinds of styles, playing with voices, that kind of stuff. And I thought it would be interesting to cover a genre as well as short stories, just because, generally we tend to on this podcast, we're talking about books, talking about styles, but looking at sort of the attempt to name a style in, I would say, because this came out in 2006, the early aughts, and then it not go anywhere is, I thought, an interesting discussion. And also John and I have some readings and other things that touch into slipstream, such as magical realism, science fiction, also postmodern literature. And she also mentioned that she thought it was funny how they don't really know what slipstream fiction is in the introduction of this book, and they spend some time trying to define it, but they sound very kind of confused. Like if you look at the very first bit for the introduction, it says slipstream, the genre that isn't. And the fact that we're kind of trying to explain that to you, listener, I thought would be an interesting idea for a podcast episode to explain why slipstream didn't catch on, and also the fact that this book actually contains a lot of famous writers that I have not heard described as slipstream.
Yeah. So I think it's important to note before we kind of dig in a little deeper, this book came out in 2006. So mid-aughts. At this point, that is an amount of time that I don't fully want to think about. I guess 17 years? Jesus.
Yeah, 17 years.
Woof. Yeah, so this came out in 2006. There are some names in this book that were fairly famous at the time and have gone on to remain fairly famous. Some people who have had a good deal of mainstream success outside of kind of genre fiction and into more literary styles. So we have a story by Michael Chabon. We have a story by George Saunders, who wrote Lincoln and the Bardo. We have a story by Ted Chiang, who has gone on to be very, very successful. I know he had a big short story collection a couple of years ago called Exhalation.
He also gave a talk at my school recently, so I think he's getting a lot of attention.
Jeff Vandermeer, who is probably one of the most kind of prominent voices in contemporary science fiction fantasy genre writing. They're all in here, as well as some folks who maybe aren't as mainstream successful, but very well known in kind of the circles you and I run in, Ben. People like Kelly Link, Theodora Gose, Jeffrey Ford. Yeah, like I said, these are people who have gone on to be very successful, but are very successful, like really completely unassociated with the genre. So I think that this is a situation where people are seeing a trend in kind of the literary space, as it were, and they're kind of looking backwards and trying to like find a name for it. So they're noticing these trends and they're trying to figure out like, okay, is this something new? And if so, like, what do we call it? And like, where does it go from here? Which I think is how a lot of genres start. You know, Horace Walpole, who we spoke about in our Castle of Otranto episode, he did not go into writing that book with the thought that he was going to start a genre. He didn't think he was starting the Gothic when he wrote that book. He did, but he just thought he was writing kind of a fantastic medievalist story, drawing on medieval stories and Shakespeare plays that he liked a lot. So genre, I think a lot of times is looking backwards, but this feels like a much more deliberate attempt than maybe other examples.
Yeah, and an attempt, I would say, to sort of classify almost like an intersection of two emerging genres. And I think the interesting bit in Sterling's essay is he talks about how, like, you know, it used to be you'd read sci-fi and you'd sort of like see the sort of the wonder and the fact that you're living in an emerging scientific age. And he goes, now it's all like Lovecraft parody and they're trying to bring in fiction and other like highbrow stuff. And I find the intersection of the lowbrow and the highbrow kind of interesting. And I think that's also something I wanted to talk about because we both have interest in that. And I like what you said about Walpole, John, because I believe Walpole said he was trying to combine like two kinds of romances, like the sort of the romance of the old, where there's knights and mistaken identities and people come together, but then this like new romance of like psychological sort of, you know, exploration and interiority. And even if, as we said in Castle of Otranto, it's kind of like, you know, a little silly and everyone's kind of crying or being scared. Like he's attempting to merge two genres together that have existed before.
Yeah.
And so I think that's sort of like how it gets created.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't think about kind of the highbrow, lowbrow thing, but now that you say that, like it's very obvious. You know, I think that it's really interesting, you know, looking at a lot of these writers. You know, I think Chabon in particular, obviously someone who spent a lot of his life reading Lovecraft, reading comic books. You know, Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay is probably one of his biggest novels, and that's all about it's not about a superhero, but it's about comic book writers. And so he is clearly someone who has spent a lot of his life kind of immersed in low culture, so to speak, and, you know, has then gone on to, be this very highbrow literary figure who writes books that, people at the New York Review of Books or other fancy publications, have a lot of nice things to say about, which is not kind of how we typically think about successful literary figures. We think of people basically being devoted to the classics from like the day they're born, and like they're just pulling from all these important reference points. And it's like, yeah, a lot of people, especially today, are pulling from both ends because, yeah, those kind of divides aren't as strong as they used to be. And I feel like that is also a story here in talking about slipstream as this kind of attempted genre, is the fact that these boundaries just don't exist in the same way that they used to be. So there's a section, the initial essay in this book links back to a essay from 1989 by Bruce Sterling, which is the source of the term slipstream. So this is a term that had been at least somewhat in use, since 1989. So we'll say late 80s, early 90s was kind of when this term first entered the air. He mentions that science fiction is kind of, in his mind, reached kind of a low point. There was a time when it was this bold new genre that was pushing literature forward in interesting new directions. And he puts it like the vanguard of progressive mankind, the Communist Party, science fiction had lost touch with its cultural reasons for being. It had just become like a self-perpetuating like collection of images that was just there to ensure that there was still like room in bookstores for science fiction. And as someone who spent a lot of time in bookstores growing up, I kind of agree with that. Like I look back at like what was in like my science fiction section at like my local Barnes and Noble when I was a kid, and it wasn't necessarily books that were interesting or books that were experimenting or pushing like science fiction as a genre any further along. It was just stuff that had certain aesthetic tropes. It had flying saucers or laser beams or dragons, on the cover. And there is an element, I think, today where there is no more bookstore in the same way. Like the internet has really sort of
like collapsed.
Yeah, everything's kind of collapsed in. Like there's like Amazon has like genre listings, but I don't know of anyone who actually uses them to like figure out what they want to read. Like I don't really think there are many people who are just looking at like the top 100 science fiction or the top 100 literary fiction books like on the Amazon list and like deciding what to read based on like what that is. I think that people are hearing about books through a lot of different ways, and people are drawn to, maybe certain aesthetic tropes or something like that. But I think that there are a lot fewer people who self-identify with genres in the way that they used to. I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all. I think there are some genres where people still really do strongly identify. Like horror, I think, has a very, very strong like sense of community around it that I don't see in like science fiction fantasy readers.
I'm glad you mentioned horror too, because I think you can trace this maybe to like the 60s or 70s, but it used to be that if you're an author and you wanted to be published and you were writing for science fiction and you had some literary aspirations, writing for science fiction would be considered slumming it. And in fact, I have a friend who would probably get mad if I don't mention this. He is doing his dissertation in science fiction, and he mentioned that one of the reasons science fiction books tend to trend towards 300 or 400 pages is because it's cheaper to print more of a book than less. So the fact that there are these sort of like, i.e. slumming it or like production concerns in science fiction is an interesting sort of background to what Slipstream purports to do, which is to make it more literary. So there's kind of like this push towards, again, like with horror, highbrow horror or elevated horror, which I know some people have very strong opinions about and don't particularly like, because they're like horror is supposed to be pulpy and gross and uncomfortable and not arty. But I think we've moved past that, the initial backlash against elevated horror. But I think like, yeah, the internet has kind of collapsed genres so that we don't really concern ourselves with like this weird mixture that this book in 2006 is kind of looking back to the 1989 coinage of the term and putting it forth again and saying slipstream is still a thing. Check it out. Here's a collection of a bunch of authors that are slipstream.
I mean, like when I personally like am doing my reading, like there are times when I will like look for a book that fits like a genre label. They tend to be a lot more distinct than like fantasy or even like horror or science fiction or romance or, you know, these kind of traditional genre labels that we hear and maybe like are still pasted above like different sections of a Barnes and Noble store. Like I'll be looking for like, oh, I want to read like something that's like sword and sorcery or something that's like wuxia. But like I don't identify as like a fan of those genres as like an identity as like a reading person, if that makes sense. Like, and I bet I know you're somewhat the same in terms of like we kind of read everything. Like we're not genre devotees, and I feel like that is more and more common these days.
Yeah, because I believe people tend to kind of pick the types of stories they like, and I think if you tend toward genre, there's obviously nothing wrong with that, but at least there's kind of a generic, like, well, I just used the word. There's like a story expectation, like, oh, a Western will have these kinds of characters, or a wuxia will have this kind of plot. It might be useful. So when we've kind of talked about this, I do want to actually point to what Sterling says, because I think it ties to what we've just been saying. So one of the things he says in the 1989 piece, which the Feeling Very Strange collection references but doesn't cite too particularly. So when he's talking about slipstream, he says, this genre is not category science fiction. It is not even genre science fiction. Instead, is a contemporary kind of writing which has set its face against consensus reality. It is a fantastic, surreal sometimes, speculative on occasion, but not rigorously so. It does not aim to provoke a sense of wonder or to systematically extrapolate in the manner of classic science fiction. Instead, this is a kind of writing which makes you feel very strange, the way that living in the late 20th century makes you feel if you are a person of a certain sensibility. We could call this kind of fiction novels of postmodern sensibility, but that looks pretty bad on a category rack and requires an acronym besides. So for the sake of the convenience and argument, we will call these books slipstream. So I think it's interesting in the need to kind of market something new. There's a need to have a fun catchphrase, even if this genre is more concerned with a sort of like feeling than a kind of stock plot. So like with horror, you know, the invasion or something, it's like, yeah, it's very feeling focused.
That's something I found myself thinking about a lot, kind of pondering, you know, slipstream this week as a phenomenon. And the name itself is, I think, a interesting thing to look at because, yeah, it doesn't mean anything at a glance. Like you say that word and I wouldn't think it has anything to do with books. Like, obviously, we've all kind of grown up with, these kind of main genres that I referred to earlier, you know, romance, comedy, drama, literary fiction, whatever. We've all kind of been trained to think of those as genres. But slipstream like feels like a marketing term. Like it feels like something that someone in advertising would have come up with to like try to sell something. It's like, ooh, the sexy new genre, slipstream. What does that mean?
Yeah, it only brings to mind like air currents or like depicting an air current as like a squiggly line. I'm like, yes, slipstream. I'm caught in the slipstream, you know, like so.
Yeah, so there's this element to it where it feels like, again, they're trying to retroactively apply like a label to this thing. Now, I don't want to like accuse Bruce Sterling of like doing this like in like a cynical marketing play. I don't think that's what he's trying to do, or that's what like any of the people like involved in the production of this collection were trying to do. But I do think that there is something very interesting that like it's 2006. This is a time where the internet is changing the way books are sold. Like Amazon is, you know, I believe a live player at this point, even if they're not as dominant today as they are now. You know, we're a couple years away from borders closing down for good. The way people are reading is changing. And I think that there is an element here where it's like, okay, like there's something new going on here. We can't exactly place our finger on it, but we're going to try to give it a name. We're going to try to give it a name which is enticing to people, because all of a sudden, like, there's a lot more competition for people's time and attention than there was pre-internet. Yeah, I think that there is a degree here to which slipstream as a construction is meant to be mysterious. But because of that, like, you can't explain it in like a minute. Like, listener, I don't know how you're feeling right now. You might be still kind of struggling to totally understand what we're talking when we're talking about slipstream. So maybe let's you and me sit down here for a second. Let's figure out what our definition of slipstream is going to be, and then we can start actually looking at some of these stories.
Right. And I think I agree with you, because yeah, the more you kind of look at it, the more it kind of disappears. But one thing I will say is if the last bit from Sterling is that he mentioned slipstream is not all that catchy a term, and if this young genre ever became an actual category, I doubt it will use that name, which I just coined along with my friend Richard Dorset. Slipstream is a parody of mainstream, and nobody calls mainstream except for us skiffy trolls. So I think it's interesting that it's already a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Now, if I were going to define slipstream, in our way or my way, I think I kind of go back to what I mentioned earlier in the fact that it's combining like generic expectations with the sort of experimentation in tropes and style that we might associate with like either highbrow literature or maybe even like postmodern literature, which even that is a little like iffy. But I would say, like, according to this book, in their introduction, they mention slipstream tends to use things like collage, allegory, various kinds of mixed styles, playing with generic expectations, and doing the kinds of things we might associate with like high literary modernism, but applying them to like genre stuff. And I think that is a useful way for me to think about it, at least. But also, I want to go back to the affective thing, because he says in the Sterling essay, he says it's about feeling strange or how you feel with a modern sensibility. And this is where the Feeling Very Strange book makes its contribution to the genre in the introduction, where they define feeling strange or the postmodern sensibility as cognitive dissonance. So there's some kind of cognitive dissonance that's being produced by these stories, and they're also playing with genres, and they're also using literary techniques that we might apply to, high modernism, if we want to avoid using postmodernism as like another category, which is also kind of sus. But instead of getting into that, let's just say it's high modernism techniques, which we're going to talk about when we talk about the stories, plus the cognitive dissonance, plus I would say a little bit of like the wonder / fantasticness, which Sterling doesn't like, but I think is in this collection.
So what I'd say, my kind of definition here, and I agree with most of what you just said there, I think that the key thing here that they think defines this genre is friction. It's a feeling of friction between the strange elements of the story and the more mundane elements of the story. And I mean that both in the sense of the literal in the story friction between kind of a mundane reality and a supernatural event, and also the friction you experience as a reader reading a story that is blending the sensibilities that you do not expect to see together. So despite the name kind of evoking quick moving air currents, I feel like, for me at least, slipstream comes down to like the sense of friction.
I'd like to, before we talk about the stories, point about the cover of Feeling Very Strange, because I think the cover of Feeling Very Strange kind of points to what we're talking about. So the cover of Feeling Very Strange has 2 pull quotes, and you might think one of the pull quotes might be, "Finally, I know what slipstream is," or "A collection not to be missed." But the first quote says, "A story should be an axe to break the frozen sea within us, Franz Kafka." And then the second quote just says, "Make sure you read all these stories." Like the quote literally says, "Oh, these stories, don't stop until all have been read," which is the bookless starred review. So the book is telling you a story should make you feel stuff that you don't normally feel, and also don't stop until you've read all of these. So there's, again, kind of like a pressure to kind of, one, experience this feeling, but also to have that friction, as John said, which I think is a great way of putting it, about like whatever it is, if it's cognitive dissonance about the construction or about what the story is sort of depicting.
Excellent. All right. So without further ado, I do think it is time for us to actually dig into some of these stories, because we've talked a lot about just kind of genre definitions, but at the end of the day, this is a collection of, stories. So let's fucking talk about them. Ben, why don't you pick our first one?
I'm gonna be a little selfish. Let's just talk about the Shaban one, because the Shaban one is, honestly incredible. It's called what is it? The God of Dark Laughter. Yeah, the God of Dark Laughter. And if we're gonna use some of the stuff we talked about, I think it is attempting to be either a Lovecraftian story that is also a sort of police procedural, or a sort of Thomas Ligotti, like a character realizes that everything is doomed, his world is meaningless, but also it has jokes. So
this story, by Michael Chabon, is, like Ben, a police procedural. It follows a detective who is investigating the brutal murder of a clown. And over the course of his investigation, he discovers that this clown may not have been entirely human. He finds out that there is a ancient sect based in, I believe, Mesopotamian like antiquity, who worshipped the god of dark laughter, and they basically worshipped this god, and as part of like their disdain for like all conventional society, like they started inbreeding and eventually became like super pale, and like their faces got distended into like weird grins, so they became clowns. And then they were also hunted down by the devotees of the god of
tears, crying, the crying god.
Yes, they are. So these people like inbred themselves into being clowns, and then they are in turn hunted down by their arch nemesis in the devotees of the god of cosmic sorrow,
whose name is AI, or I guess like IE, or like a cry of basically. And then the gods of dark laughter are called Yeheists. So, and I believe, John, I think he says Armenia, which is sort of a weirdly specific location for when this cult started. I guess modern day Armenia, so Mesopotamia. This
starts. It's kind of like what if True Detective was about a clown?
Also, I gotta point out the setting is in Peru, Indiana, which was considered to be like the town where traveling circuses go in the winter. Is Peru, Indiana, like it's the off-season town. And I think that's a great setting. It's like, basically the circus is here in the off season, but there's this brutal murder of a clown whose like face has been removed when they find the body. Like somebody had cut off his entire face, basically. Shaban says in like one flap. It's like the way he describes it.
Yeah, so I'm with you, Ben. I really enjoyed this story. I am a huge fan of Chabon, and I had not read anything quite like this from him before, and I really liked it. I'm a sucker for like a Lovecraft like pastiche, whether that is like a serious or a comedic one, and that really scratched that itch for me. I am not 100% sure I totally bought it. Like, again, as we're kind of discussing slipstream and like whether or not we think it's like a useful term, I didn't really see this as like a great example of the genre. What do you think?
And a lot of why I like the story was the dialogue. It's like Shaban was like, okay, I want to write a Lovecraftian kind of story, but I don't like how portentous this is, so I want some dialogue. So as an example, and I'll follow up to what you said, but as an example, so they, in classic kind of Lovecraftian, they find these mysterious books written in unknown languages. So they're at the crime scene, and they're describing like one of the books is in German, and another book which appeared to be religious or philosophical in black leather with no alphabet known to me, the letters sinuous and furred with diacritical marks. His partner goes, pretty heavy reading for a clown. And then he says, it's not all rubber chickens and hosing each other down with seltzer bottles, Jack. Oh, no? No, sir. Clowns have unexpected depths. I'm starting to get that impression, sir. I was just laughing out loud at the dialogue, and because I think honestly, I think Shaban's feeling himself. He wants to write this story, and I think with the plot especially, I was expecting some kind of chase, but it ends with this sort of like basically the guy gets away who murdered him, and they find the details at the crime scene that are like details that fit somebody who would be a devotee of the crying god. For instance, like the pillowcase is soaked in tears. But anyway, like he gets away, and all that happens is that the main character realizes that like life is just one cruel joke, and he has basically what he says is the worst dream of his entire life, where he enacts basically what happened to him, which is that like I believe he does not arrest a drunk driver who accidentally kills his wife and child, and so it was his shortcoming as a cop that led to the way he is now. And so he goes, this is all just some sick joke. And then it just ends there. And so it's almost like he had to end it on the Lovecraftian like realization that your life is a lie, or that you understand very little. But in terms of like mixing kind of humor and sort of Lovecraftian horror, I found it was pretty great. We didn't even talk about the baboon. There's also like a baboon as well. So yeah, I don't know if it really fits the slipstream genre. I was just like laughing. I was having a great time. I was like, yeah, imagining the True Detective adaptation. But in terms of like, I don't think it feels strange. And if anything, if it was mixing genres, it would be like, it reminds me of those like really bad 90s like crime movies that are like sex thrillers, and the dialogue is like incredibly pulpy because like this one guy wrote it. It reminds me that Shaban like wanted to do that, but with like the Lovecraftian genre or something like that.
Yeah. So like my thing with this story is that it's like funnier than your average Lovecraft story, because Shaban is like a, you know, socially normal human being, unlike H.P. Lovecraft. But at the end of the day, like this story doesn't go to places that Lovecraft doesn't already go. Like there's no friction here for me between the like fantastic and the mundane, at least in the way that I feel like some of these other stories are trying to do. Like it doesn't have that kind of magical realist element where it's like the presence of the supernatural is creating this sense of this very specific sense of unease. Like this is like very much just kind of a horror story with a funny element to it. And it's pretty straightforwardly that. Like there's nothing here where I really felt like there was a twist or a turn that really like brought it into new perspective. Yeah,
it just kind of follows the expectations. And like with the baboon, you know, they think there was a child at the crime scene, but the baboon actually features heavily in the Yi He rite, basically, where you're supposed to like wear somebody's face and dance with a baboon, I believe. Which I honestly think, John, that he wrote the baboon so that he could get the reveal. Because like literally they're like, oh, it's a child. And then one of the reveals is a baboon was staring at me when he finally finds the baboon. And then the baboon hugs him, and then his partner shoots the baboon, and he goes, "You just shot the only witness." So like, which is again like a crime, a '90s crime punchline. But yeah, it's like it kind of adheres to the main genre. It doesn't go anywhere weird or unexpected.
Let's talk about "Hell is the Absence of God" by Ted Chiang. So I don't know about you, Ben. This was my absolute favorite story in this collection.
It is. I mean, it's almost the way it works is so good because it sort of like presents this worldview and then slowly like draws you in, basically, so that it makes it's like all entirely logical what every character is doing.
Yeah. So to kind of lay out the basics of this story, this takes place in a world where God exists as an empirical fact. He is still mysterious and behaves in ways that are incomprehensible to mortals, but the existence of God is known, and the visitations of angels happen with they still seem to be fairly infrequent occurrences, but they are things that are known to happen, and people, you know, respond to them. And all these visitations of angels tend to bring miracles with them, but the miracles are kind of handed out in a way that seems very arbitrary. So there is a man, the story starts with a man, I believe, named Nathan Fisk, who has a deformity, which is actually not the result of an angelic visitation, but a lot of people think that it was. And his wife is killed in one of these visitations, just kind of in a freak accident. The angel appears, it blows up the glass in this like diner she's eating in, and she bleeds out. She's the only person who's injured in this. And it's, you know, kind of the core of the story is him trying to figure out what to do with this in this world where God is real, but it seems to have not given anyone like any more peace or like understanding of the world they live in than the world we live in.
Yeah, in fact, it sort of inspires the same kind of sort of mental work to kind of explain to yourself rationally why you should believe in God, even though in this world, like, God does exist. Also, hell exists, and at numerous times in the story, like, hell will open up and you'll like be able to look down and see if somebody's in heaven or hell. I don't know if you can see if somebody's in heaven. I can't remember. Does his wife go to heaven when she gets killed?
There seems to be like, it's a little ambiguous, I think, but there are reports like they see people's souls ascending to heaven, but also if you don't see someone in hell, it does not appear that there's kind of a third state. You either go to heaven or you go to hell.
Yeah, and as John was mentioning, these angel events are almost like extreme weather events where like it's like a tornado or an earthquake. But yeah, you can see heaven's light, at which point you have no need for eyes and you're totally convinced that God's love is real. But also you could get killed and get sent to hell. Like there's no real logic other than, as John said, God is real and heaven and hell is real. And angel events happen, but everything else is still just as uncertain and contradictory as John was saying in the real world of, you know, outside the story.
Yeah. So I really like this story because I think that this is the one where I think the supernatural element is woven into the story in like the best way, where I think it is like in some ways a science fiction story in kind of that traditional sense where it's like it is taking this, you know, it's basically saying what does society look like if we empirically know that God is real and angels show up sometimes? Like, how does society react to that, and what happens from there? But I also think that like there's this element where it's creating this really interesting tension between the fact that God is real would not probably. At least if God is real in the way that like a lot of people think about God, because a lot of people do think about God as essentially being God in this story. Like there are a lot of Americans who believe in angels and believe that angels are like active in the world, like in people's day-to-day lives. But there does not really seem to be a right, you know, that does not seem to give most people a lot of actual comfort existentially. People still worry about like why things happen, and you can justify it by God existing and doing things, or you can justify it by kind of the scientific mindset where it's like, oh, it's just atoms bumping against each other. But at the end of the day, like you still have to live with what happens in the world and respond to it. And I just think that the way Ted Chiang illustrates that kind of existential uncertainty in a world where theoretically there should be none is really, really cool. And yeah, really, really affected me as someone who is a lot more, I think, amenable to kind of spiritual ideas than maybe the average person is.
Yeah, and I think the important part that Ted Chiang really captures is like the kind of mental thoughts that you go through when you're trying to decide, like, one, what you should do with your life given that you know God is real, and two, why certain things happened if God exists. And I think one thing that I particularly like in the story is when sort of Neil is kind of deciding what kind of world he lives in, given that his wife was killed, who he loved extremely much, and she went to heaven. And so he's like, do I want to go to heaven because I love God or because I want to be with my wife? And so like that kind of like realization of, can I do something? Can I love God entirely? Or am I being selfish? Which is probably the sort of self-reflection, like if you're raised Catholic, you might remember sort of like whether or not I could do something truly good, altruism. Can I do something truly good? Or am I only doing it because I want to go to heaven, etc.? And I particularly like this one bit. So I believe he's sort of wondering why he has a leg deformity, which he thinks is just something that happened, and why, even if God had a plan in having his wife killed. And he says, perhaps he thought it would be better to live in a story where the righteous were rewarded and the sinners were punished, even if the criteria for righteousness and sinfulness eluded him, than to live in a reality where there was no justice at all. It would mean casting himself in the role of the sinner, so it was hardly a comforting lie, but it offered one reward that his own ethics couldn't, believing it would reunite him with Sarah. So in other words, he has to decide that one impossible interpretation of reality is true so that he can get to heaven, even if it's not the one that he personally believes. Like that kind of the story captures that kind of rationalization that is real, but exists in this world where, as you were saying, is not all that different from the one that we live in now.
Yeah. Anything else to say on that one?
Have you read more of Ted Chiang? Because I got the impression he was a bit more fantastical, and this seems very like grounded. Like it literally says this one thing is true, and then sort of builds everything else around it.
I have not, but I think I am going to explore more of his work now. I am going to check out that Exhalations collection that came out, I think 2019, and give him more of a look. He's someone whose name I had heard a lot, but like we always talk about on the show, so many books, so little time.
He also wrote the story that Arrival was based on, I believe.
Yes, I believe that is also true.
But yeah, I think that's all I have to say for Hell is the Absence of God. I think it's a great, it depicts psychology really well.
Yeah. If there's one story I would say to check out from this collection, it's that one. Ben, what story do you want to talk about next?
I think I kind of want to talk about Sea Oak, the Saunders one.
Yes.
Just because I think the premise of Sea Oak is like one that most closely adheres to contradictory cognitive dissonance. Because something happens in the story, and then one, the story doesn't explain it, and two, it like zooms out to make like a bigger, almost like a class related point. So yeah.
Yeah, this is definitely the one that feels like it's the most like magical realist in like the Latin American idiom, where it's using these elements to talk about like class and politics in a very direct way.
Yeah, so Sea Oak is basically, it's like, I would say it's a George Saunders classic story from 2006 Persuasion Nation. It's when Saunders is like, I am sick of American consumerism and the way we do society, and I'm going to depict it in the most like outrageous and hilarious way possible. And then there's going to be
disgusting.
Oh yeah, definitely disgusting. And then there's going to be some sort of like mordant. Well, yeah, I guess it is mordant. Some sort of mordant twist at the end to kind of like pull you out of it, basically. And so it's basically just like about a guy and his horrible job and the horrible place that he lives in, and how all of his family are just barely getting by on what he makes at this job. And the job appears to be some sort of like weird TGA Fridays where you have to basically be kind of a stripper as a waiter.
Yeah, it's like a male stripper TGI Fridays based on like fighter pilots.
Yeah. And they also have fake penises that they're supposed to sort of display. I can't remember and they wear them on top of their real penises, and that's like part of the stripping act.
Yeah. So it's about this guy. He's got this disgusting job at this restaurant that probably actually does exist somewhere in America in 2023. Probably didn't exist in 2006, but that is where the world has gone in the last 13 years. And yeah, the real inciting incident for the story is that his aunt dies, and his aunt is this old lady who has been kind of the moral bedrock of the family. She's the one who was always like reminding people to be like grateful for what they had and to do what they needed to get by, and really just kind of being this core of the family. And she dies unexpectedly, and then
she gets scared to death, right? Because doesn't somebody try to break in?
Yeah, they say that. They don't ever really explain what happens there, so I didn't devote too much attention to that. It's not really a mystery story after that.
Yeah,
but basically, she dies. She has like a heart attack. They say because someone like tried to break into the house, and she was literally scared to death. And then like 2 days later, she shows back up, as a zombie, essentially.
Yeah, she's a zombie. She's a reanimated corpse.
Yes. And she has gone through like a complete change of attitude after dying. Whereas once she was very much like this, be grateful for what you have, down to earth type of person, she is now this hyper ambitious, hypersexual, mean spirited monster who has decided that she is going to get the family like whipped into shape.
Yeah. And so before she'll say things like, what a nice day we've had, when Saunders is clearly depicting, what horrible sort of like they have to like literally scrape to get by. So then she comes back and she says, you know how to read, right? Bernie shouts. You ever heard of a recipe? You ever been in the grave? It sucks so bad. You regret all the things you never did. You little bitches are going to have a very bad time in the grave unless you get on the stick. Believe me. Turn down the thermostat, make it cold. I like cold. Something's off with my body. I don't feel right. So yeah, she's like basically like, I'm gonna force this family into shape. And she keeps telling the main character, the guy that works at the shitty job, he has to like show his cock more to get more money to actually like make it right. She's like, you gotta show a little skin. Like so.
Yeah. So it takes this very like kind of bitter edge turn where the aunt comes back and she's done a full 180 and you don't quite know where it's going to go, except for the fact that she is still rotting like at a pretty quick pace. And so the main character and the other characters in the family kind of unsurprisingly are not able to make a full 180 right away to kind of get where she wants them to be. And before they are kind of able to fully develop in one direction or another, she fully rots back to pieces and is for all intents and purposes dead again. And the story ends with this really just like kick in the teeth ending where the main character has a dream about his now dead aunt asking, why do some people get everything and I got nothing? His aunt was someone who, from what we can see in the story, like did everything right, as she's told by the culture, but she was never successful. She never actually had any real degree of comfort in her life. And so when she dies, she has all these regrets. She says she never had a lover in her entire life. She's never had money. And, she thinks that she gets this brief reprieve from oblivion to come back. And she's like, I'm gonna do all the stuff I never got to do. And then she dies again. And it's just this real just kick to the teeth of just, God, why do some people get so much and some people get nothing?
And there's some great like little Saunders kind of, I guess it would be like backstory reveals, and he does them very compressed. So like at one point he's like, I think, the aunt took one day off from where she worked, which is I think called Drug Town. And she's like, I'm going to have a day off. I'm going to go on vacation. They go to Vegas and she gets robbed. So she doesn't even have like a good time at Vegas. And then also there's like a backstory where like he has this failed relationship that didn't work and he sees her at his job and he goes, she can't see me like this. So like there's like these sort of like unfulfilled lives that are stuck in this sort of position based on, like basically the class position. And then they can't get out of it. And she comes back from the dead and it's like, I don't know why this is the case. And he goes, I don't know either. And then it literally just like ends there.
Yeah. And, I think that something that's kind of in this story too is like, the aunt comes back and she has all these plans. I don't get the impression that even like, let's say she hadn't rotted and died again, I don't think that it would have worked. She tells the main character like, you're going to go to community college. You're going to do pre-law and become a lawyer. And it's like, I'm not saying no one can go from like working at a cock bar to being a lawyer, but it's not quite that simple.
Yeah. And like, even like the sort of the will to do it is definitely part of it. But the Saunders contrasts that with her body literally falling apart as she's saying this. Like her like arms are all over the place and like her head descends, like all that's left is her head at one point. Yeah. So.
Yeah. This was one where after I finished it, like I had to put the book down for like a little while because it was just, I mean, it's one of those things where again, like we talk about like 2006 versus now, like, I don't want to say like this story was prescient, but there is this element where like, I don't know, this is kind of what feeling in America in 2023 feels like.
Yeah, John, particularly this bit. For dinner, Jade microwaves some stars and flags. They're addictive. They put sugar in the sauce and sugar in the meat nuggets. I think also caffeine. Someone told me the brown streaks in the flags are caffeine. We have like 5 bowls each. like it's like the and if you ever read Persuasion Nation, like his entire book, all the stories in the book are like that. It's all like just Saunders like sort of hyper exaggerating stuff that he's observing in 2006 and then putting in those like sort of twists of psychology or emotion or backstory. And the cognitive dissonance, like they say in the title, is literally like, yeah, one, why do some people have everything and I have nothing? Why, if I work really hard, I still might not succeed? And also, like, yeah, why is everything so consumer and driven? It honestly sucks. So,
yeah. And then he wrote Lincoln the Bardo, which is one of the most beautiful novels about America ever written.
I do think like I need to read more late Saunders, but I think he kind of like, I wouldn't say mellowed out, but I think he got a less angry maybe because like yeah.
I think it's just like kind of the turn a lot of people make where it's just like, yeah, this like ad buster shit just like doesn't work. Like it doesn't.
Yeah, like one of the stories in Persuasion Nation is about like being trapped in a commercial and having to do the plot of the commercial over and over again, even though you don't want to. So like, yeah.
Like, so good story, but man, just I felt a little rough after reading it.
I quick shout out. A friend of mine, Zach, you can take Saunders's short story class on Substack if you're so inclined. And he showed me some of his stuff, and Saunders has some really great, like, sort of what he thinks the story does, how it works, what are some historical examples. And then presumably if you can pay for the Substack, you get to take the class. If anyone's interested, definitely check that out. It's a good resource.
Yeah, I have not gotten around to reading it yet, but I was gifted a copy of his kind of guide to fiction writing, which is called what is it called? To Swim in a Pond in the Rain, which is kind of using his readings of the Russian classics to give a masterclass on writing. So I appreciate that a lot about Saunders. He is clearly someone who's very passionate about making, like, teaching writing and kind of learning about writing accessible to people.
Yeah.
So yeah, seems like a really good guy.
Do you want to? Yeah, where should we go next, John?
Let's talk about a bad story. Let's talk about one of the ones that we think kind of didn't work on like either a genre level or on just kind of a level as a story. So we did rank all the stories, listeners. We obviously don't think we're going to get to every story in this collection. It's just not feasible. We kind of broke them down by like good, mid, and bad. So I think we should talk about a bad one.
How about Light and the Sufferer, which I feel like sort of it's got that sort of weird fantastical element, but it doesn't quite do anything with it. And in fact, I was telling John before we started recording that I think if you removed that fantastical element, it wouldn't actually change anything about the story. So yeah, the premise of Light and the Sufferer is that the protagonist is trying to kind of get his brother to move to California because his brother is basically addicted to crack. And as he's going to tell his brother this, they're in New York. His brother and him basically rob a dealer, or it's more like a lower level dealer. They rob a lower level dealer, and he keeps trying to get his brother to consider getting on a plane to California. And his brother's like, I got stuff I got to do. And so it's basically like a story about one of like a family member who's too far gone down a path, and you're trying to get them to get off the path, but there's sort of a kind of tragic inevitableness of what might happen. And in this sort of closely observed realist story, Lethem throws the idea of aliens into there, and they're called the Sufferers. And the aliens are, I don't know about you, John, but I kept imagining the dragon from How I Trained Your Dragon.
Yeah, they're these animalistic, like, all black creatures. The description never gets very specific. I was kind of imagining like the aliens from Attack the Block, if you've ever seen that movie.
That would be better. I don't know why I was imagining the like cat dragon from How I Trained Your Dragon, but like, yeah.
but yeah, they're not they seem to have like an animalistic level of intelligence. Like they can't talk.
They also can't seem to be killed or yeah.
Yeah, they seem to be basically immune to any kind of like normal violence people can inflict on them, but they follow around people who are addicts.
Yeah.
Broadly, that's the impression I got. They follow around people who are addicts or in some way are suffering. And yeah, like the story kind of wants to make this point about like the brother is not literally the sufferer, but he reads the sufferer like as someone who's following his brother because his brother won't look out for himself.
Yeah, and the alien ultimately has a good intent. The alien wants to help the brother succeed, to avoid smoking crack, to go to California.
But maybe like it can't express that because of its inhuman nature in some way. So yeah,
Lethem has a lot of fun with writing these social realist scenes and then inserting this alien into them to sort of like make characters uncomfortable or to like comment on what's happening.
Do shtick.
Yeah, shtick. But like, so ultimately what happens is he can't help his brother. The top level dealer shows up and is basically like, I need my drugs and money back. There is a scuffle and his brother is accidentally killed. And he points to the aliens and goes, you didn't do anything. You didn't help him. You're actually just having sex with another alien while this was happening. And he smokes the crack and then the alien shows up and he gets really mad. And then it just kind of ends.
Yeah, you know, I when we were talking kind of before the show, you said like this is the one where it really feels like the genre elements are completely incidental, and I agree with that. You know, like I think there's an interesting like kernel of an idea here in terms of like, okay, like these aliens are here, they're attracted to people who have these problems, and so people like want to read these in like their own intentions on them, like they're kind of anthropomorphizing these creatures that have at some level inscrutable desires and goals. But whereas like I think like the Ted Chiang story does something similar, but does it in like a way that actually is like interesting and gets like to a deeper point. The alien in this story feels like a distraction the whole time. It feels like it's everything with the alien just feels like it is getting in the way of this story. And this story already felt so long. This story to me like felt like it went on forever.
Yeah.
And it might be that it was right after Sea Oak, which, like I said, was a very like affecting story for me. And this just I felt like I like hit this like very like weird kind of queasy high with Sea Oak and then just like came crashing down with this one.
I felt like it wanted to be the kind of like Bad Lieutenant, like Dark Night of the Soul, like one fucked up thing to the next fucked up thing, but it just ends up kind of like going really slowly along. And then everyone is always talking about the alien because I guess it gives, you know, something to do for the dialogue. And, you know, when you brought up the comparison to the Ted Chiang, I think that's interesting because I think ultimately they're trying to capture that kind of feeling that like you could interpret anything that happened to you any way you want. And in fact, you can, but also sometimes your interpretations don't work. They don't add up and they change. And so like with Ted Chiang, it's like I have to interpret God to decide what to do with my life. But with this one, the protagonist is like, the alien must be helping my brother because I'm helping my brother. But then when the alien doesn't help his brother, he goes, I didn't do anything. I wasn't helping at all. And I was like, well, if you just took the alien, you could just have this as a story about like following your brother and trying to help him. It's like the alien is only there to reinforce character psychology. And I think that's not really taking advantage of what the slipstream could do in terms of like, you know, presenting this sort of fantastical element converging onto the real in a way that's like, you know, taking advantage of like either high modernism or like, you know, tropes of genre. Instead, it's just like it could just be an animal or something. Like, I don't know. Like imagine imagine we rewrite the Sufferer, except he's got like a parrot and the parrot is like saying like, what's some crack? You know, And he's like commenting on what's going on. And then the parrot, like one time it looks like the parrot's going to save the brother. Like, let's say the parrot flies and grabs the crack pipe and then flies away. It's like, oh, maybe the parrot will help him. But then during the final gunfight confrontation, the parrot doesn't help him. We've essentially said the same story. Like, I don't know. I don't know why I was thinking about it. I just kept wondering if you remove the alien, does it work? And it doesn't. And I think if it did succeed, according to the slipstream definition, you would have to have the alien there.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I kind of meant when I was talking about like friction is like the defining characteristic here. It's like in this story, it just felt like two things like stacked on top of each other with no like productive friction. I think that there is like a lot of bad writing that is either you could call it like it's stuff that might self-identify as slipstream, and kind of the way that like MFA students are probably like some of the few people who would ever hear about slipstream, or you might just call it bad magical realism. But there are definitely like people who they write pretty bog standard literary fiction, and they just add a genre or a fantastic element to it and say, hey, it's something, it's not just boring literary fiction now, it's something different. And this story very much felt like that. Like it just felt like there was no blending of the elements. Like it just felt like you had this boring social realist story, and then you had a boring alien just stuck in the middle of it, and it did not ever it never became more than the sum of its parts in the way that like I think Seok or Hell is the Absence of God really became more than the sum of their parts.
Yeah, and I think I like that you brought up magical realism, because one thing we didn't mention is that this book is interspersed with blog posts from 2005. I can't remember where they were posted, but basically authors were writing about Slipstream. And one thing that they're sort of consistent on in the blog posts is that it's not magical realism. And I think magical realism is interesting because, well, one, I'm sure you've all heard about it, sort of like Latin American fiction where fantastical things can happen and they're sort of explained as if they're already fine and they're not actually fantastic. And I think if you kind of get into magical realist authors like Marquez, there's a sort of actual folk tradition, the way his grandmother would tell him stories. There's kind of like an oral tradition to this kind of equal treatment of the fantastic and the mundane. And I think that sort of source of it doesn't exactly translate to, somebody just saying, well, what if a dog could talk in my story? Like that would be magical realist. And like, unless, and I think this is where Slipstream wants to be, unless there's like a logical explanation for why the dog is talking, logical in a sense that it fits the story and isn't just arbitrary, then you're getting somewhere towards Slipstream. And it's like, here's a world where dogs talking is a real thing that's accepted as fine. Like, where do you get from there? And like, one thing I want to mention is like when I took a couple MFA classes in undergrad. And while I didn't know about Slipstream at the time, magical realism was really fascinating to me because I wasn't really into socialist realist stories. I don't know. I think, at some point you're like, I don't know if I can write a compelling story about, I don't know. Again, like they seemed like a hard place to get to. And I found magical realism compelling because you could introduce these elements. Like, what if this was real, and then build from there? And that was kind of like why I found it interesting. And along those lines, I want to mention something real quick. So in the Sterling quote, he says, wonder isn't a part of it. And he's like, maybe there's some comparisons with magical realism in terms of treating the fantastic as real. And I think this made me think of, a while back, I had read Shaban's first book, The Mysteries of Pittsburgh, which is a great sort of like coming of age novel that occasionally veers into like Shaban's like fantastic wonder prose, but isn't exactly like Slipstream because there's no like, oh, this thing is real now. It's more just like the characters pretending as if like something magical is happening when it's really not. Like one example is they go to eat lunch somewhere and they see this factory that puts out clouds and they don't know what the factory does. So they just call it the Cloud Factory. But anyway, the important part is this is why I think Shaban writes the way he does. And he explains it in the sort of bit for why he wrote The Mysteries of Pittsburgh. But it gels really nicely with, I think, what Slipstream is trying to do. So Shaban says real quick, duly, I had written my share of pseudo-Ballard, quasi-Calvino, and neo-Borges. I had fun doing it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop preferring traditional bourgeoisie narrative form. I wanted to tell stories, the kind with set pieces and long descriptive passages and round characters and beginnings and middles and ends. And I wanted to instill, or rather, I didn't want to lose that quality inherent in the best science fiction, which is sometimes called the sense of wonder. If my subject matter couldn't do it, if I wasn't writing about people who sailed through neutron stars or harnessed suns together, then it was going to fall to my sentences themselves to open up the heads of my readers and decant into them enough crackling plasma to light up their eye sockets for a week. But I didn't want to write science fiction or a version of science fiction, some kind of pierced and tattooed, doctorate holding, ironical stepchild of science fiction. I wanted to write something with reach. And so I think what you're describing, John, it's like, oh, we're going to rethink science fiction, or we're going to make our boring story magical realism. Like, there's a better way to do it to kind of combine the things you want. And I think that's at least what Shaban would say Slipstream is if somebody asked him.
Yeah, if he even personally identified with the term at this point, which, yeah, I mean, he's in this anthology. That's the interesting thing again with this anthology. I think it's such a strange document. There's like obviously the people who are in this collection like all signed on to be in something called like the Slipstream anthology. But I don't know if you like went up to Michael Chabon, you went up to George Saunders, you went up to Ted Chiang, and you were like, hey, do you identify as a Slipstream author? I don't know that they would self-identify.
Yeah, the
that
intro
way.
doesn't name names, but it does say some people were surprised to know that they were Slipstream. So, yeah. So,
I mean, well, there is this interesting element. We're reading this book. It's from 2006. Like this term, I think pretty definitively did not catch on.
Yeah.
I don't know to what degree we can say Slipstream is like an active genre. Like there are definitely books that I think still fit this kind of broader idea of friction between the fantastic and the mundane. But yeah, I don't know that anyone actually currently thinks of themselves as like a Slipstream writer.
Yeah.
Apart from maybe, I assume Bruce Sterling does because he defined the term and he's also in this collection. But yeah, I don't know that anyone outside of maybe some MFA students are consciously identifying as Slipstream authors in 2023.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting. Kelly Link, who gets thanked in the intro, and she has a story in here. She also, with her husband, Gavin Grant, she runs Small Beer Press and the magazine Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet, which has made them an irresistible force in the world of Slipstream publishing. So maybe, we could see if they're still publishing, but it's interesting that they kind of called in some people who do publish Slipstream, at least at the time. We don't know if they're still publishing, so maybe they are.
Speaking of Kelly Link, I know one of your favorite stories in this collection was her story, The Specialist Hat, which I'll be perfectly frank, I was left a little cold by. But I would be really interested to hear like what you found so affecting about that story, and yeah, just kind of know why you think this is a good example, since it seems like if there is like a definitive like Slipstream author, Kelly Link is like up there as one of them.
So I think it is the fact that on a sentence by sentence level, I really like what's happening. Like the story, I think, is a ghost story, maybe, but the sentences do a lot of weird subversions. There's weird references to nonsensical songs. There's weird constructions that you don't normally see in a ghost story. And on a sentence by sentence level, I just was like thoroughly creeped out. It's a really nice, like looking at it's like, to me, it makes the most good on the promises of like the fact that Slipstream could be, genre with literary aspirations, because like the sentences are working overtime for me. And I also read this on Halloween, so some remnants of the spooky season episodes we did. When I was reading it on Halloween all alone in the house, and I was thoroughly creeped out. And what do I mean by the sentences? Even on the first page, so there's these two twin sisters, already, I guess, sort of shades of The Shining, and they're hanging out with their babysitter, and we don't really know who they are yet or why they're there. But they have a game where they're pretending to be dead. And you're like, okay, this is probably a game. But then Claire's face is stubborn. When you're dead, she says, you stay up all night long. When you're dead, the babysitter snaps, it's always very cold and damp, and you have to be very, very quiet, or else the specialist will get you. This house is haunted, Claire says. I know it is, the babysitter says. I used to live here. So and just in that bit, there's already like several things going on in terms of like where the footing is, what's real, what's not real. But then once you get into like basically the songs that there are various songs just interspersed within the story. And that stuff, like, again, the use of collage, I think it really adds to the whole thing, and it just makes good on the affordances of the genre. So, like, at one point, they talk about the specialist hat, which is like some weird non-hat thing that's in the house. And there's a long list about what the specialist hat makes a noise like. The specialist hat makes a noise like a tapir. The specialist hat makes a noise like a rabbit. The specialist hat makes a noise like a squirrel. The specialist hat makes a noise like a curacao. So like I don't know, like on a sentence by sentence level, I think it's doing what Slipstream is supposed to be doing. And sure, if the story is just, oh, it's a ghost story about a haunted house, it's kind of like The Shining. It's like, yeah, okay. But I don't know. There's a lot going in there in terms of like craft. And I think that's why I liked it so much.
Yeah. So I agree with you in terms of like the craft element. I think this is a beautifully written story. And yes, on just a sentence by sentence level, Kelly Link is doing a really amazing job here. My issue with it is I got to the end of the story, and so I feel a little like two ways about this, because there is this element where when I read stuff like this, I never want like the message, the point of the story to be too apparent, too didactic. Again, that's a big part of why I didn't like Light and the Sufferer, because where that story's going from like the first page, and then you have to read like 20 pages to get there, and it's not any more edifying at the end than it was at the beginning. But I felt like I got to the end of this story and I didn't totally, like, I didn't get what was going on entirely. Not on like a logical level of like, oh, this is like, this happened, so this happened, so this happened kind of way. Because it's not that kind of a story. Like, it's not like a plot or like a mechanics issue, like thing I had an issue with here. But again, that frictional element, which I think is here because like this is a story that's playing, I think, a lot with Gothicism. You didn't mention this in the synopsis, but the twins, they're living in a house that was owned by like this romantic poet that their father is studying and writing a biography on. And it's this creepy old house, and this poet was the guy who owned this weird like hat thing. So there is like an element of like, there's a ghost element, there's a gothic element here. But I got to the end and I was like, okay, like I get what's going on here with like the genre element, and I get like that we have these two girls kind of living these otherwise fairly mundane lives, but I didn't get what that friction was supposed to be communicating to me.
Yeah.
Like it didn't ever like totally click together. And I'm wondering if you got more of a sense of that, aside from just like, you obviously, I envy you that you kind of, I read this like 11 o'clock on a Saturday, so I didn't quite get the same vibes from the story that you did.
It might be useful to mention what we think happens. And I think what happens, as far as I can tell, is that the babysitter is another ghost, and that the real babysitter, at one point, the real babysitter is like locked out at the end of the story. So the babysitter who is introduced as the babysitter is just another person who got killed. And I think the twins got killed, or they're either going into basically the spirit realm. So like he moves into this house, he's taking on this poet's work, the father, he's becoming the poet. And as a result, he repeats what I guess happened in the past, which is that people got killed by either some malevolent spirit or somebody else. And so like, there's this sort of like, I guess basically it's just you move into a haunted house and the same stuff happens to you. But I think to me, the sort of effective vibe is like, I always feel like the floor is going to give out. Like I'm going to suddenly know what's happening, and it never does. You're just kind of left like not knowing. And I really liked that in terms of like I think what the intro was promising about what was in the genre. Cause I was like, oh, I never really get what's happening, but I like everything that's happening sentence by sentence. So
that is interesting. I didn't think about that. There might be something kind of in the refusal to totally adhere to the genre convention, because in a lot of these kind of gothic ghost stories, they end with, here's everything that happened. Like, oh, the ghost was this person. They died, however many years ago. They were murdered by this character who's still alive, and that person's going to face justice now. There's kind of this tidy ending that a lot of those stories have. And the fact that this story is refusing to give us that and ends on this very ambiguous note might be kind of where I'm supposed to be finding that tension and getting this point that even as we were talking about this, I still don't feel like I'm totally getting it, but now I'm kind of wanting to revisit the story in a way that I kind of didn't want to.
Well, two small things. One, this is towards the end. On the lawn under the oak tree, she hears someone calling her name. Samantha climbs out of bed and goes to the nursery window. She looks out through the wavy glass. It's Mr. Coleslack. Samantha, Claire, are you all right? They're always locking me in the tool room. Goddamn spooky things, he says. Are you there? Samantha, Claire, girls. So I think in that moment, you're like, okay, the babysitter is not actually the babysitter. The babysitter is either a ghost that they're playing with or is some like malevolent spirit. And then after that, right as it's sort of coming down, they think the specialist is their father, and then they run away. So either like the father is taking on the madness of the poet before that, or I don't know, there's like they're getting sucked into like the spirit vibe of this house. So like, yeah, there's no big reveal. There's no rational explanation. It's just kind of like an uncertain ground that you're on. And I think in terms of like keeping you interested as a reader, I think the sentences do it a lot better than say like Light and the Sufferer, where it's supposed to be kind of like your standard social realism, kind of like, here's what happens. So
cool. All right. I think we have time for one more story.
Yeah, I think we'll end with one more story. Bright Morning by Jeffrey Ford. John, what happens in this one?
Yeah, so Bright Morning is essentially about an unnamed protagonist, a first-person narrator who is an author, and it is about his obsession with a Kafka short story that he encounters as a young man. He's introduced to it by kind of this odd friend he has in school, and it is a Kafka story entitled Bright Morning. And as he gets older, he gets this collection from the library, reads the story in it. He gets a little older, he goes back to revisit it, and he finds that the story is not in any other Kafka collection, and no one that he talks to about it seems to be aware of its existence. And eventually it comes out that there might be a demon who Kafka was attempting to exorcise, who was vampirizing Kafka in a way that the demon in the story parasitizes like a young artist, like an unnamed artist, and that the demon was exorcised into the story by Kafka, but now that demon has also begun to parasitize the writer of the story, of the narrator of the story that we are reading. So there's a lot of layers here, but I was also getting some Ring vibes.
Well, yeah, big Ring vibes. And also, so he meets up with his long lost school classmate who told him about the story, and he's auctioning off the story. And the narrator is convinced that he needs to read the story to basically become a better writer, because he's done all he can with science fiction or fantasy, and he needs to do something else. Then who walks in but a writer by the name of Jeffrey Ford, who is not the narrator, and Jeffrey Ford purchases the book and then basically disappears into ash, more or less, or as it says, evaporated, basically, and the pages are scattered. So Jeffrey Ford, the author, who is not the narrator, but who is the real author, is basically consumed by the demon. And I want to point out, I absolutely love how this story starts off like I'm a writer, I'm reflecting on my life in the sort of like non-fictional, like personal memoir vibe. And you're like, okay, this is charming. And then suddenly like the rug gets slowly pulled out from under you. And you realize that like, basically there's something off about this story, like the one that he's obsessed with. It doesn't actually exist, or it only exists in one book. And the way that creeping kind of, I guess I would say fear or uncertainty, or like, you're like, okay, actually something's going on here. This isn't a personal memoir. It's disguised as a story. It's like actually, like a Ring infection kind of thing. I don't know. The way that slowly creeps over your realization as you're reading it is like really good. So,
yeah. Well, because it starts, yeah, like I said, it's kind of a cute story. It's about like, oh, he's like encountering Kafka for the first time, and Kafka is clearly an author that like a lot of these slipstream people, whether they're self-consciously a member of that genre or not, like get a lot out of. They pulled a Kafka quote as a one of the review quotes for this book. Obviously, Kafka
reviewed by Kafka.
But you know, I think that there is this really cool element there where it's like, yeah, it's really drawing in this figure who seems to be so influential on this whole idea and this whole kind of literary vibe, if we want to call it that, versus, you know, a defined genre. And yeah, brings him in this very direct way where he's not a character in the story, but his personal history becomes part of like the story of this guy's life.
Yeah.
And I do think there is like there's definitely like, even though the protagonist ends up not actually being Jeffrey Ford, like I at least was getting the impression through most of the story that it was supposed to be Jeffrey Ford until Jeffrey Ford himself actually shows up. And then it's like, oh, this wasn't Jeffrey Ford.
Also, you could even interpret it as the Jeffrey Ford that shows up is the Jeffrey Ford that is just going to keep writing Kafka hack stories, and that he's killing off the Kafka hack part of himself. Like, because like the last sentence is about the Ford who shows up in the story, not the narrator. One of the early pre-publication critics of the book wrote in a scathing review, "Ford is Kafka's monkey." So but
I think there's also an element here where I'm gonna say one of the magic phrases of the podcast: anxiety of influence. Like I feel like there is this thing here where Kafka is this guy who is, I think, pretty universally considered a genius for writing stories that, if they were being published today, would at some level, and maybe not exactly today, but kind of in the modern literary world, you know, like we'll just say the post Warriors up to now, would be considered hack work. It'd be considered pulpy sci-fi stuff. You know, obviously Kafka was not writing about little green men and UFOs and stuff, but he was writing these stories that are focused on, these kind of, for lack of a better term, fantastic elements intruding into everyday life. And he's considered to be a genius and is universally praised by the literary establishment.
John, along those lines, so when we were researching for The Name of the Rose, I found that Umberto Eco had like a joke that he did where he was writing rejection letters for famous works of literature. And for the Kafka one, it's like, tell us more about how he became a cockroach. We need the backstory. I'm sorry, if you don't tell us the backstory, we can't accept your story, Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. So he's basically like predicting, like, what you were saying, that it would, like, if this stuff happened now, we would write it off under a number of explanations. So
yes. But I think there's also this element where it's like, I think there's an element where it's like, okay, why can't people writing in this idiom today seem to achieve the same level of notability or respect in literary spaces? Like, you know, the protagonist, like, basically seems like he just churns out story after story after story, kind of this low genre idiom, but he wants to write something better. And so he has to go back to this Kafka story to like find the key to that.
Yeah.
But I think also from Ford's perspective, there's this element where it's like, okay, like, and I think it's kind of more broadly about slipstream as well. Like, there's this idea that we're doing something new, but we're really not. Like, this has all been done before. Like, you know, the Chabon quote you read earlier, you know, pseudo Kafka, pseudo Borges.
Yeah.
Like, none of this is actually new. It's just that in the past, 2 or 3 guys got to be famous for writing that stuff, whereas now you have a much larger pool of people who want to write that stuff. You have a larger pool of people who like want to read that stuff, but they aren't getting like the same level of respect because of just the way that the literary world has changed. But I think that also, like, when you're a writer like Ford, it's like you want to feel like you're doing something new. No one fully wants to just be like knocking off their influences, even though we all know deep down that that's all any of us are doing if we have a creative practice. Like, no one is actually doing something new, but the desire to do something new and the worry that we're not doing something new is still always there. And that's something I found very, very interesting in the story.
Yeah, and it has to kind of be dealt with. And I think I love you were mentioning how he like the narrator writes all this fantasy. I love this sort of casual summary of everything he's done. In 4 years, I've done just about everything I could possibly do in fantasy. I told you already about the flying head, the cloud city with attendant panopticon, but there was much more. Demons, werewolves, men turned into blue stone, evil geniuses, postmodern fairy tale kingdoms, giant moths, zombies, parodies of fantasy heroes, an interview with Jules Verne, big bug aliens enamored of old movies, Lovecraft ripoffs, experimental hoodoo, and that's just for starters. Like he's just sort of like casually summing up his career, kind of in like that kind of like I'm out of ideas. That's all I do. So like, but yeah, I think like the fantasy of killing off the version of yourself that is too into Kafka is a very anxiety of influence interpretation, John. So I think that's pretty much like, because again, he disappears into mist, the guy that is Kafka's monkey, that is also the name of the author of the actual story. like he gets disapparated. So
yeah, I really like that quote you just did, because I think there's something else there that I know in like my personal like writing practice I've struggled with before. And when you're kind of writing, when I write, like I'm primarily writing in, I like, again, would not say I'm a slipstream writer, but I'm primarily like working kind of like speculative fiction. And there is this element where it's like, okay, I have all these interesting images in my head, but do I have something interesting to say?
Yeah.
Like you can come up with a bajillion like kind of cool ideas, but are they actually communicating anything of value to the world? And I think that's another thing the story is grappling with. It's like, yeah, that's why Kafka is great, is because he was writing stuff that was imaginative, but was also communicating something like very deeply like true and very deeply felt in a way that a lot of genre fiction just does not, because it's so obsessed with just imagery and tropes.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that anybody who's kind of on this dividing line of like literary and genre like has to grapple with at some point, or is eternally grappling with. Is just like, yeah, like you want to write cool stuff, you want to write stuff that actually like is meaningful and good. How do you square that circle? Yeah. And I think Ford does like a really, really good job like grappling with that question in the story. This was another one that I really, really, really loved.
Yeah, two other small things. One, I like the Shaban quote because like Mysteries of Pittsburgh is like a good coming of age novel. I wouldn't say it's amazing, but it's well written and it's fun to read. But I think him articulating it as like, I want the bourgeoisie, literary socialist realist narrative, but I want the wonder. Like that's I mean, that makes sense to me if you read Shaban, and it's like that's really all you need for a first book. It's just like I want this plus this, and if I do it real in a way that's real and true, like you were saying, then people will get something out of it. And I think relatedly, one last thing, Blake Butler, he's been published on Apocalypse Party. He has this thing that I've been thinking about that he talks about in, I think, one of his Substack posts, where somebody said in his MFA that the more concrete you are, the more metaphoric people will think you're being. So like if you can like be very descriptive and concrete and true, then people are just going to get like big stuff out of it. Whereas if you were just like, oh, what if a bug loved an old movie? It's like if you don't give that like concrete realism, then, people are just going to write it off. So, yeah,
I remember, this is not a specific quote, but I remember reading kind of something about genre as a very young person. I was a kid at the time. It was basically just saying like one of the kind of defining features of science fiction is that it's interested in ideas, but the characters tend to be very flat. Yeah. And I remember just thinking like, well, what if you had interesting ideas and the characters were also well-rounded?
Yeah.
And I feel like that is something that I am like working through in my own creative process. I feel like that's something that a lot of authors in this collection are thinking about. When I say science fiction, I'm also talking about fantasy. I'm also talking about any kind of like speculative genre. But I think that is what Slipstream is like trying to define into existence, is this space for the highbrow and the lowbrow to meet one another. Whether or not it succeeds at that, I frankly, this might be a good way to kind of wrap things up.
Right. Yeah.
Kind of, yeah. How much do we find slipstream as a term useful or meaningful? Personally, I don't at all. Like, I obviously have worked through this episode kind of trying to carry this definition in my head, this idea of like this friction between fantastic and the mundane kind of leading to this element of strangeness. I don't think it works. I think that there are too many stories in this collection that don't seem to meet that criteria. I think that there are plenty of stories that blend the literary and genre like elements in ways that don't do that, but still work fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I also
agree.
think that we are living in a time where we just need to fucking put the literary genre divide to bed. Like, it makes no sense to still be talking in these terms, which are just terms for marketing.
Right.
There's no deeper truth to them. They're completely like empty categories. They're all just about aesthetics, and like aesthetics basically is class signifiers, because highbrow people read this kind of book, lowbrow people read this kind of book. Guess what? No one's fucking reading anymore. Like, if you read now, like you're in a class like of itself. There's no reason to continue these inane categorizations, and I'm done with it.
Speaking of nobody reading, my copy is a library book. It was not checked out. So,
what about you, Ben?
Yeah. Well, okay. Before I give my summing up take, I just want to read this bit of dialogue from Bright Morning because it sounds like Sopranos. So he's like, everybody says I'm Kafkaesque in the opening. As my neighbor, a retired New York transit cop, told me while holding up one of my novels and pointing to the cover, this Kafka shit isn't doing you any favors. All I know is he wrote a book about a guy who turned into a bug. What the fuck? He's a great writer, I said in defense of my blurbs. Tom Clancy's a great writer. Kafka's a putz. So, I read that. I just imagined somebody from The Sopranos saying it, because it's very punchy, but it's like, I don't know. It made me smile, I guess. So, in terms of whether slipstream is interesting or not, you mentioned speculative fiction, and I realized I hadn't even thought about that. And when I was going to class for my MFA, I didn't get an MFA. When I happened to take some MFA classes in my English major, speculative fiction was the big thing. And I think it's referencing what you're saying. Like, I want to be able to do both things. And I think, like you're saying, John, you should just do both. You don't have to worry about classifying it. That's for the PR people to do later. And I think, like we're seeing now, if people do read, they go to specific publishers that they like, because the publishers advertise their books in specific ways. Like we've talked about NYRB. We love NYRB because it's classified a certain way, and the PR people did a great job of selling us on it. And the stuff's actually good too, because it's not just like
Gotta have my nerves.
I gotta have my nerves, John. And again, it's because one, did you think the author? No, the books are written before nerves existed. So like, yeah, if you're writing now, I think you should just do what you want and do it in a way that's true to you, and let the marketing team figure it out, as opposed to like debating like whether or not X is slipstream or not. So
yeah, I mean, that's what I really came away with from this collection, is like, I did not come out of this being like, wow, I love slipstream. What I came out of this thinking was like, damn, I want to go read some Chabon and Saunders again, because I really like them and I like what they're doing. And I think that is where I am. It's like, there are writers I like, there are, aesthetics I appreciate, but I personally am completely uninterested in trying to spin genres out of like Gossamer and like thinking that was going to change like the literary world.
Yeah, and alternatively, if you spend a lot of time on Rate Your Music, you'll find this list where people that post on Rate Your Music are imagining putting genres together before like making music. So they're just like, man, I'd love to hear a release that combines trip hop with shoegaze. And it's like, this seems like the wrong way to go about it, because that's like signifier first, you should do the thing and then worry about the signification later. I don't know. So yeah.
No, I this is not the last time we're going to talk about this stuff, I'm sure. I think that for better or worse, like the literary genre divide still does exist to some degree, and
right, yeah,
we're gonna have more conversations about it. But this is where I am after reading this collection.
I also, John, I'll sum up and say I enjoyed a trip down 2006 lane, the year that time forgot, honestly. So, and it was nice to go back and see how people thought and felt then, and to catch up on people we like now, like Siobhan and Saunders. So,
yeah, just kind of as a little thing at the end here. Don't really think that there's like a whole conversation to have here. It was very interesting. Some of these stories felt very, very contemporary. Some of them felt like a little bit more dated in a way that was a little surprising. Like, I didn't look at the year this was published when I first picked it up, so I didn't quite know this was like a 2006 book. But yeah, very few, like, no smartphones in this, which I'm just realizing.
One explanation for that, John, is something that I don't know what to do with. But if you look at when all the stories were published, most of these stories were originally published in the 90s. So I
don't have like a deeper point there. Just interesting. I guess the short story can be like a surprisingly timeless genre because it doesn't always give you time to like notice the things that aren't there.
Right. Yeah. It's more about making you feel or experience something in like a condensed way. So
yeah. All right. Well, that is our show for today. Hope you guys liked this format. If you did, please let us know. If you did not, please let us know as well. We want to make you guys happy.
Like and subscribe. Follow us on, whether you want to follow us on Twitter. We have a Twitter account now, or Spotify, or on our individual accounts, which we've plugged before. Join us in the Infinite Library.
Yes. Wait, Ben, before we go, we do have to let the nice people know what we're reading for our next episode. Yeah. So our second episode for the month of September, just in time for Thanksgiving, we're going to be talking about Charlie Portis's Masters of Atlantis.
Oh, yeah. Awesome. Okay.
One you picked, Ben. Can't believe you forgot.
I thought I honestly, I was like, I didn't know what we were doing. I don't know why. So I'm so excited.
So we're gonna be talking. We're gonna be back in novel land. This one should be a bit more on the like funny side. So I think I think it's gonna be a good ep. So join us back in 2 weeks for that. And then we will have some announcements about some stuff coming up here in December after that. So have a wonderful rest of your day. And Semper Books.
Semper Books.
Thank you for listening to the Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.